Good morning, everybody. My name is Hendrike Nienborg. I'm a member of the steering committee, and it's my real pleasure to introduce Josh McDermott from MIT this morning. Josh's work, he works at the intersection of experimental psychology, neuroscience, cognitive science, and computation, and has made groundbreaking discoveries about how humans perceive and interpret sounds. The breadth of his work is really impressive, ranging from computational and imaging work to field work in remote cultures to reveal how humans hear musical sounds. What is also really inspiring, I think, to me, at least to me, is that he's really drawing from broad experiences in vision sciences, working with Nancy Kenwisher, Tate Alderson, and Eero Semencheli, and applies these approaches to the field of auditory science. So I think he's therefore also a really great role model on how to combine computational and experimental work, which is one of our goals here at CCN. And needless to say, his CV includes a long list of awards, including the Trollner Research Award from the Academy of Sciences. And with this, I'd like to welcome Josh, and thanks for joining us.
Hey, thanks so much for that kind introduction. I'd like to thank the organizers for having me, and I want to give special kudos to the organizers because this is such a new meeting. I think it's great that we have this as a thing to go to, and my lab is excited to be here. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how we hear. Kendrick was just telling me how the only reason they invited me is last year everybody complained there was too much vision, so they needed to have an auditory guy in the mix. So let's start by doing some hearing. I'm just going to play you some sound. Close your eyes and just listen to this.
What about Jackson?
Okay, so the point of playing you that is just to kind of point out the obvious thing that sometimes we lose sight of because we do this all the time, and that's just that you infer an awful lot about the world from sound, right? So you were listening to that, and you could tell that that was a recording made in a sports bar. You could tell there were a couple people talking. You could also hear the voice of the announcer from the TV. You could hear somebody clapping. You could tell they were watching football, and so on and so forth. And all of that was happening with sensory input that looks like this, right? So there was some vibrations that traveled through the air. They caused your eardrum to wiggle back and forth in some particular pattern. And from that funny pattern, you were able to make all those judgments, right? So of course, you don't care about the vibrations themselves. What you're interested in as a listener is what happened in the world to cause the sound. And the reason that's an interesting problem is that most of the properties of interest are not explicit in the waveform, in the sense if I show you the sound waveform, or if I give it to you in digital form and let you run some simple classifier on it, you're going to have a hard time telling me what happened to cause the sound. And we think that's why you need a brain. What your brain does is takes that input and then transforms that through cascades of sensory computation into representations where you can more readily read off the stuff that you need to read off. So that's really the question that unites all the work in our lab, namely how it is that we derive information about the world from sound. So I run a research group at MIT called the Lab for Computational Audition. We work at the intersection of psychology and neuroscience and engineering, trying to do experiments in people to understand how it is that we solve the difficult computational problems with sound, and also working with machine algorithms as ways to test those ideas and develop new hypotheses. So there's kind of two strands of research in the lab. There's what I would call auditory scene analysis or scene understanding, and that tends to make less contact with the brain. So there's 3 presentations at this meeting kind of from that strand. So Maddie had a poster last night that hopefully some of you saw. Victor and James have posters later today. We also work a lot on auditory representation and maybe what you might call recognition problems, and those tend to have a lot more to do with auditory neuroscience and cognitive neuroscience. And so Janelle has a talk coming up, and Dana's got a poster later today on that kind of work. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about that sort of thing. So most of you probably know that the peripheral auditory system is pretty well characterized. This is a picture of the ear. So sound gets funneled in, comes through the ear canal, makes your eardrum vibrate back and forth. Those vibrations get transmitted via these 3 little bones. In fact, you can't see. Can you see my pointer? Yeah, you can. So these are the 3 smallest bones in your body. They transmit these vibrations to this thing that looks like a snail. That's the cochlea that does the sensory transduction in hearing. And one of the key signature properties of cochlear transduction is that it's frequency tuned. So this is that snail structure kind of unwrapped a little bit. It consists of a couple tubes separated by the basilar membrane. So vibrations enter here at the base, and that causes vibrations to be set up on the basilar membrane. And so that membrane has this property that it varies in thickness and stiffness along its length, and so the natural resonant frequency varies depending on where you are in the cochlea. So one of the key discoveries about the ear was that if you input a low frequency, the vibrations tend to peak down at the base of the cochlea. If you input I should have said that if you input a high frequency, the vibrations peak down at the base. If you input a low frequency, they peak up at the apex. If you put in something in between, you get something in between, okay? So we now have like a pretty standard peripheral auditory model that most people in the field work with some version of, where you have a sound signal that gets passed through a bank of bandpass filters that mimic the frequency tuning in the ear. The output of that are what we call subbands. And then we often summarize the information in those subbands with the instantaneous amplitude or the envelope. You can kind of think of this as a crude model of what the auditory nerve is sending to your brain. And so one way to think about that information is to depict it visually. Most of you have seen spectrograms. This is a version of a spectrogram we often call a cochleogram because it's generated from a cochlear filter bank. So we conventionally plot frequency on the y-axis and time on the x-axis, and then the gray level here would indicate the intensity of the sound at that particular frequency and point in time. And so this is a cochleogram generated from this clip of somebody drumming. And so one way to think about that spectrogram is as taking the output of this auditory model, taking each of these amplitude envelopes from frequency channels and then plotting them in grayscale. So if you stack those horizontally, you get a picture like this. So when you look at this, it looks kind of messy and noisy, and we think that's mainly because your brain is not used to getting the information in this format. We actually think that a lot of the information that matters perceptually is contained in this picture, and so we often think of this as kind of what the auditory nerve is sending to your brain. So the key question that we spend a lot of time thinking about is what happens downstream. And because we often think of the auditory nerve as kind of like a spectrogram-like representation, it's very common to characterize neurons downstream in the auditory system with respect to that representation. And so these are pictures of receptive fields. These are like best-fitting linear filter characterizations of different neurons in the auditory cortex of a ferret. And you can see that these neurons appear to be tuned to different kinds of spectrotemporal structure, where the sound energy varies in time and frequency, and sometimes both. And so this has led to common characterizations of the auditory cortex in terms of linear filters in time and frequency. So this is one such example. And so these kinds of models are common, they've been useful, but they're also clearly limited. It's kind of like a model of V1, which you know is not going to do a great job of accounting for object recognition. Now when you look in the human auditory cortex, things have been, until recently, pretty murky. So I think it's not a total stretch to say that there's arguably only one totally uncontroversial feature that you find there, and that is this phenomenon known as tonotopy. And that refers to the fact that there's a map of frequency selectivity that kind of mirrors what you see in the cochlea. So this is the result of an experiment that was done in humans where we stuck them into a functional magnetic resonance imaging machine, played them different frequencies, and then are color coding the voxels in their auditory cortex displayed on an inflated brain in terms of the frequency that elicits the highest response. And so when you do this, you see a pretty standard organization where it kind of goes from high to low to high. And that's a tonotopic map. And so that's commonly identified with primary auditory cortex. And this is sort of the one thing that kind of I think everybody agrees is there, in the sense that lots of labs find that it always looks the same. It's there in every person, always kind of in the same place, so on and so forth. On the other hand, it's pretty much just recapitulating what you find in the cochlea. It's not clear like what it's good for or why it's interesting necessarily, but it's there. So in non-human animals, it's common to propose an organization into 3 stages. People will often talk about the core and the belt and the parabelt, which are thought to be kind of 3 hierarchically organized stages. They're differentiated by cytoarchitectonics and connectivity and neural tuning properties. And so there's some evidence for this in various kinds of non-human species. It's really, I think, unclear at this point if there's a similar organization in humans. Okay, so that's kind of a whirlwind tour of one take on the state of auditory neuroscience. And the agenda for today is to discuss some recent work that we've done to try to clarify the situation. So we're going to ask whether we can better delineate function and structure in human auditory cortex, and also whether we can build better models of the underlying computations that would account both for perception and potentially neural responses. Okay. So in part one, I'll tell you about some work we've done exploring auditory cortical tuning properties. This is work by Sam Norman-Hegner, who was a grad student with us at MIT, who was advised by me and Nancy Canwisher. He'll be coming soon to the job market near you. And it uses a method he developed called voxel decomposition. So the motivation for this work was that we thought there was relatively little known about human auditory cortex and a lot of possibilities for what one might find there. And so it seemed desirable to probe function in a fairly open-ended way. And so the approach that we took was to measure fMRI responses to a pretty big set of natural sounds, and then to try to infer canonical stimulus tuning functions that would best explain the voxel responses that we observed to those sounds. All right, and so the first thing that we did was we came up with this pretty big set of sounds, and we went to considerable efforts to try to get a set of sounds that really span the set of things that you hear in everyday life. So here are the top 50 of that 165. They're ranked according to the frequency with which people claim to hear these sounds. I'll just play you a few of them. They're all 2 seconds long, so this will go down the list.
It's supposed to either rain or snow.
Hannah is good at compromising.
Okay, so that's 1 through 20. You can kind of imagine what the rest sound like. They're kind of fun to listen to. So we put people in a magnet. We played them these sounds in order to get stable responses to what's a fairly large stimulus set. We scanned people multiple times and pooled the data. And so the outcome of the experiment is that for every voxel, we get its response to each sound. So these sounds are pretty short relative to the time constant of the bold signal that underlies fMRI. We don't think there's a whole lot of temporal information at that time scale. And so we essentially get one number for every voxel, which is its average response to that sound. Okay, so for every little voxel, you get 165 numbers. So when you throw these all together across all the voxels in the auditory cortex of all the participants, you get this big data matrix. So it's 165 dimensions here and about 11,000 here. And that's just the result of the experiment, right? All that data. And so the question is whether we can look at that data and determine anything about the auditory cortex from its structure. So in order to do this, we posited a linear model of voxel responses. So we tried to approximate each voxel's response, which is symbolized by this thing here, as a weighted combination of a fixed set of tuning functions, which are these R's here. Right? So the idea is that the R's are fixed across the voxels. There will be weights that are unique to each voxel that specify the contribution of a particular tuning function to that voxel's response. All right, so we want to find the R's and the W's that do the best job of accounting for the data. Okay, so you can think of this as a matrix factorization problem where you're trying to approximate this big matrix as the product of 2 lower rank matrices. So one of them we'll talk about as containing components. So this is a set of response profiles that gives you a response to each of the sounds. Okay, so those are 165 dimensional, and there'll be some small number of those was the idea. And then these weight vectors that tell you the contribution of a given component to every voxel that is in our data set. Okay. So the problem of doing this factorization is ill-posed. So there's a bunch of different solutions. And so what we did to constrain the solution is to search for components that have maximally non-Gaussian voxel weights on the logic that this will yield a unique solution if the data was in fact generated in this way. Okay? That's something we could talk about more. So many of you will realize that this is pretty similar to conventional ICA. There are a few technical differences, but it's pretty much like ICA. Okay, so the first question you have to answer is how many components are you going to use? And so the way that we selected that was by evaluating the goodness of the predictions and cross-validated data. And when we did that, we found that 6 gave us the best predictions and left out data. And so additional components seem to basically be modeling noise. And I don't know that there's anything magical about the number 6. It's probably a result of the particulars of our experiment, the number of sounds and the sounds we chose and the amount of data that we have. But for our experiment, that's what we got. So the outcome of this analysis is 6 dimensions in the space of sounds, each of which is characterized by a response profile. So again, that's a 165-dimensional vector, and a weight vector that specifies the contribution of that response profile to every voxel in the auditory cortex. And so we can now look at these things and try to understand what they are. And the key point here is that the analysis here really didn't know anything a priori about what the sounds were or where the voxels were in the brain, right? It's just this big matrix, and you're just trying to approximate it, okay? So all this stuff is kind of unconstrained by prior hypotheses, which was kind of the goal. Okay, so I'll show you what these look like, and we can look at these response profiles in this way. So these things will be represented as bar graphs, where each bar corresponds to a sound, and they're ordered according to the response of the sound in the component. Okay. And what we'll do, just to try to give us some sense of what's going on, is color code the bars according to the category of the sound. So this was a big, diverse sound set. There was some music, instrumental and vocal, different kinds of speech, vocalizations, other kinds of stuff. Okay. All right. So there's 6 components, and the first 4 of them, and I'm not going to tell you how we ordered them. It's not really critical. But the first 4 of them don't show very clear organization with respect to these colors. Right? They're just kind of like a mix of the different sound categories. And it turns out, and I'm not going to show you evidence for this claim, that these components are pretty well described by acoustic properties that we understand, that you can measure in these sounds and then use to predict the responses. So the first 2 actually seem to capture frequency tuning. So remember, I showed you that tonotopic map that I was arguing is there in everybody. Here's another example of it. And I'm going to draw white and black outlines around the high and the low frequency lobes in the map. And these are the weights for the first 2 components that emerged from this analysis, with the tonotopic map outlines superimposed on them. And so you can see there's a pretty tight correspondence between the weights of these 2 components and the tonotopic map. So one of them really seems to capture low frequency tuning, and one of them seems to capture high frequency tuning. Right? So this is not particularly newsworthy, but it's maybe reassuring that the analysis kind of gave us the one thing that everybody really clearly agrees is there. Okay. Now, the thing that was more newsworthy, and that was really the main finding to come out of this, is that when you look at the last 2 components in terms of the types of sounds that we had, you find that there's like pretty clear structure. Okay. So you can see that for this component, the big responses are all either light or dark green, and those are the 2 types of speech that we used, English and foreign. All right, and then the light blue is vocal music, so singing, which is kind of like speech. So it's basically whether or not the thing responds depending on whether the sound is speech or not to first order. And the other component gives you a big response whenever you have blue, and that corresponds to instrumental and vocal music. Okay. And so if you just average the responses within these categories, it looks like what you would expect. So big responses to English and foreign speech, and to music with vocals here, and to either instrumental or vocal music here. All right, so this suggests that these 2 types of tuning functions are important for accounting for the voxel tuning that you observe in human auditory cortex. So we can then ask the question of where do these components actually land in the brain? So we can take the weights for these things and now display them on the brain. And so again, I'll reference that to the standard tonotopic map. And this is what you get. So the 5th component, that's the one that is speech selective, resides lateral to the tonotopic map. And it's interesting, it's pretty bilateral in the right and left hemisphere here. And the 6th component, that's the one that is very music selective, lands primarily anterior to the tonotopic map. So remember, we think of that tonotopic map as kind of corresponding to primary auditory cortex. And so this suggests that there are these distinct loci of selectivity for speech and music that are in different places in non-primary auditory cortex. So now the speech selectivity here kind of replicates a lot of previous findings, including some that we were involved in. The finding of music selectivity is pretty new. This was like the first clear demonstration of that, I would argue. And the fact that they are in different places suggests to us that there are these distinct pathways for speech and music in non-primary auditory cortex. And that was kind of the key finding from this study. So I'll also encourage you to check out Dana Bobinger's poster later today. So she has followed up on this work asking the very interesting question of whether the representation of music in the brain is different depending on whether you have had a lot of experience playing music. And I'm not going to tell you the answer. You have to go to her poster to find out. So this gives you a little taste of some of the interesting things that we think reside in non-primary auditory cortex. And the question that I'll now turn to is how we can develop models of sensory coding that can explain some of these kinds of phenomena. Okay? Now, like many people in this room, we have noted with interest the tidal wave of artificial neural networks that has taken over the engineering world over the last 5 years. And so we have recently been asking whether we could learn better models of the auditory cortex by leveraging modern-day neural network technology. So the approach here would be to hardwire a model of the cochlea to be faithful to what we know about biology, and then to learn everything else using a neural network, and to see whether we can consider the candidate model as a model of the auditory system. So I think everyone is well aware of the similar approaches that have been applied in the visual cortex. So a lot of this happened in my department with Dan Yeamans and Jim DiCarlo, also Nico Kriegeskort, who's organizing the meeting. And so these have really been successful in terms of showing interesting analogs between the structure that emerges in deep neural networks and in the ventral visual system. We thought that this approach might be particularly useful for the auditory cortex, where there was much less consensus about how things were divided up into pathways and stages and so forth. Now, this is a very sophisticated audience, and so I think everyone is also aware of the reasons why this might be a bad idea and why you might not expect that a deep neural network and the brain might really look like each other. So of course, in order to train a neural network, you need a ton of labeled data. That's not really how people learn. Some people say that the learning rule is unrealistic. I think Tim Lillicrap is going to be talking about why that might not be the case, but there's debate over that. It's also important to remember that neural networks primarily do classification, usually just the classification task that you train them on, and so that's kind of not a very realistic view of perception. They're also usually feed forward, although there's now a lot of work trying to extend that. So there's all these issues, right? So we've nonetheless been excited by the fact that these technologies give us stimulus computable models that can achieve human level performance on some tasks. And so as someone who's always been interested in kind of real world signals and real world tasks, this has been kind of an interesting development and something that we've thought was worth exploring. So the first question that we posed is whether a neural network that is trained up on some task that has some relevance for humans exhibits human-like auditory performance characteristics. So if you think that it might be worthwhile to compare this to the brain, minimally it kind of needs to do some of the same stuff. So we started training networks on some tasks that we thought were relevant to humans, and then investigating their behavioral characteristics and comparing them to people. So one of the first tasks that we started working on is a speech and noise task. So we took excerpts of speech, superimposed them on different kinds of background noise, and then asked the network to tell us what the word in the middle of the clip was. Okay, so in this case, there's going to be 2 seconds of speech, and the speech says gross domestic product grew. This is an excerpt from the Wall Street Journal speech corpus. It's a big speech database. And so the correct answer would be domestic. So this is what it sounds like.
Gross domestic product grew 1.
So there's like some train station noise superimposed on that or something. So this has classically been the kind of task that was a big challenge for automatic speech recognition, something that people are very, very good at, and seemed like a good thing to explore. And so in the version of the task that we set up, there's like 600 different words, so there's a lot of possibilities. So I should say that this work was led by Alex Keller, grad student in my lab, in collaboration with Dan Yeamans. So Dan was a postdoc in our department. He's now a faculty member at Stanford. And a lot of it is described in a paper that just came out recently. So the networks are optimized using pretty standard methods. So filters are trained up with backpropagation, and we also do some optimization across the architectural hyperparameters to find a network architecture that performs well on the task. So like I said, the key question of interest is whether or not the behavioral characteristics for the network in humans are similar. And so we ran them each on the same experiment. So we we took this task of word recognition and noise and set up a bunch of different conditions where we varied the background noise and the signal-to-noise ratio. And these experiments were run by Erica Shook, who was a visiting undergrad in the lab. And this is what you get. So this is the plot of human performance on this task. So we're going to plot performance correct on the y-axis and the signal-to-noise ratio on the x-axis. And so as the SNR goes up, that means the noise is going down, and that means the task should get easier. And indeed, that's what happens. But the different lines here represent different kinds of background noise, and you can see that some of them are easier than others. So it's much easier to recognize speech superimposed on music than it is to recognize speech superimposed on speech babble, which is just crowd noise, essentially. It's a bunch of people talking at the same time. Okay, so that's what happens if you run humans on this. I'll now show you what happens when you evaluate the network on the same task. And this is what you get. So there's two things to note about this. The first is that the overall performance of the network is on par with what you get in humans. This is the thing that we wouldn't have been able to do 5 years ago, but nowadays is kind of commonplace. But the second thing is that the relative performance of different conditions is pretty similar. So the conditions that are easy for the human are easy for the network, and vice versa. Okay? So if you just look at the correlation between the performance of the model and the human on these different conditions, it's very, very high. And so this was really the first find that kind of got our attention, made us think that maybe this was worthwhile looking into in more detail. And I think there's a couple different interpretations of what might be going on here. One is that these graphs essentially just represent like the best you can possibly do on this task, in the sense that there's some fundamental limit to how well you can do. And any system that you optimize for the task, if it does well at the task, it's going to end up being limited, and give you a performance characteristic like this. There's a more exotic interpretation, which is that because this is a neural network, maybe there's somehow some algorithmic similarity between what is happening in the human auditory system that might not be mirrored by some other class of model. And at this point, we don't really have evidence to distinguish between those, and I am agnostic with respect to that. But at any rate, maybe it means that it's not totally crazy to go looking inside the network or comparing it to the brain. So the question I'll next turn to is whether we can use these kinds of neural network models to model the auditory system. And when we considered how to build a model of the auditory system, we thought that the best shot might be to get a network that could do more than one thing. So speech recognition is kind of a specialized task, and we thought at least having another task would probably be a good idea. When you do this kind of work, you're of course limited by tasks that you can get labeled data for. And so in audio, there's lots of labeled corpora of speech. There's some labeled corpora that pertain to music, and so that's where we got our second task from. So our second task is genre recognition, where you hear a little clip of music on noise, and you have to say, oh yeah, that's punk or disco or hip-hop or gospel or whatever it is. And we would not want to argue that this is a task that's critical for human survival, but it's one where we could get labeled data because there was an existing corpus that had these labels in it, and it's a non-trivial task. All right, so we got these two tasks, and you then have to decide how you're going to construct your model. And so the way that we did this was we initially did a big search across architectures to find the one that would do best on a single task by itself. Okay, so this is just a schematic of the particular architecture that emerged from that. It's got some number of layers and some particular ordering of operations and so on and so forth. All right. So then given that you have that architecture, the question is, well, how do you get it to do more than one thing? And there's a range of possible ways that you could set this up. So maybe the simplest thing is you have a single neural network that culminates in kind of two different output layers that has the class labels for the two tasks, and those tasks are then mediated by the same set of features. Of course, at the other extreme, you could have two totally separate auditory systems, one for speech and one for music, then just make different decisions at the end. And then there's a range of intermediate possibilities where you have some number of shared stages of features that then kind of split up, and you have some task-specific sets of features. So the question was how to really decide between these. And so what we did is we examined the effect of these architectural choices on the ability to perform the tasks. Okay? So it's kind of obvious that you'll do the best possible in this case, where you have totally separate systems for the two tasks that can be kind of separately optimized. And eventually, you might expect that you would kind of take some hit, but it's not completely clear what would happen in between. So we looked at that. So this gray line here is the performance on the two tasks. We have the speech recognition task on the left and the genre recognition task on the right. And the gray line is the performance of the totally separate network architecture on the two tasks. Okay. And then what I'm going to be plotting is the performance of these alternative models that will have what we call a branch point that is occurring at different places in this architecture. So as you move from left to right on the graph, the branch point gets later and later in the network. So here's what you find. You find a pretty similar thing for the two tasks, which is that if you start with this architecture here, we have two totally separate pathways, and you push the branch point forward a little bit, you don't really take a big hit in task performance, right? So it's like the task can tolerate having sort of the same filters or features in the early stages of things. But then eventually, performance starts to decline, right? And forcing the two tasks to share the same features causes impairments in performance. And so we selected an architecture where the branch point was kind of as late as possible without taking a big hit to task performance on the grounds that that's kind of the simplest model with the smallest number of parameters. And so that's what you get. So it's kind of a dual pathway model where speech and music are sharing some early stages of computation and kind of splitting up and having these kind of small dedicated pathways. Now, given what I told you in the first part of the talk, it's no surprise to hear that we were interested in this, in part because it seemed reminiscent of those findings that we had recently had of distinct places in non-primary auditory cortex where we observe selectivity for speech and music, right? Which is kind of naively consistent with this idea that there might be distinct parallel pathways in non-primary auditory cortex. Okay? So it's at least kind of consistent with that and maybe gives us some converging evidence that that's like not a bad way to set up an auditory system. And I think more generally it's an interesting possible method for generating hypotheses about how pathways ought to be set up in the brain by looking at how tasks interfere with each other. And that's an interesting thing that we'd like to explore more. Okay, so we've now got this model, and the question is, well, can you do anything with it? And so the first question I will pose is whether you can use this model to explain cortical responses in the brain. So to address this, we took the data from the experiment I talked about at the start of the talk. So these are fMRI responses to this big set of natural sounds. And so this is a schematic of that fMRI experiment where you have sounds, you put them into the brain, and you measure responses. Right? So you can then kind of do the analogous experiment on the network. So the network's never seen these sounds before, but it's a stimulus computable model, so you can put whatever you want into it. And every sound will give you some particular set of responses in a particular layer. So all the different hidden units have some particular pattern of responses across the sounds. And we'd like to know whether there's similarity between the representations in the network model and those in the cortex. And so the way that we address that is using the kind of standard method of trying to fit a linear model that will map between the network responses and the brain responses. So we take half of the sounds, we fit a linear mapping using regularized regression, and then measure the variance that is explained in the left-out data. Okay? And so the outcome of this is for every layer in the network, we get a measure of the variance that is explained in every voxel in the auditory cortex. Okay? And so we do this across lots of splits of data and so forth. Okay. So as a baseline procedure, we're going to perform the identical procedure with that linear filter model that I showed you very briefly at the start of the talk, which has been a common way to explain this kind of data. So here's the outcome of that experiment. So this graph is going to plot the median variance that is explained across the entire auditory cortex by every layer of the network model. So the gray line here is the variance that is explained by that simple linear filter bank model. And this is what you get. So you can see that the early layers of the network are not doing a very good job of explaining the responses, and the late layers also don't do great. But in the middle, we do substantially better than the main kind of previous model for this kind of thing. So you might wonder, well, what is it that is really causing the shape of this graph? So one obvious thing to ask about is what happens if you look at this with a network that has not been optimized. And so that's what happens if you just take a network with the same architecture but with like totally random filters, so the exact same procedure. And so you can see that there's two things to note about this. One is that there is some effect of the network depth. So as you move into the network, the predictions get a bit better. And you might think of that as maybe like a receptive field size effect, like the scale of the features kind of becoming appropriate, maybe. But overall, the predictions are substantially worse, and you never do as well as like the baseline model. Okay, so what does this tell us? Well, a lot of neuroscientists are interested in whether you can explain variance in neural responses, and so by that metric, we now have a better model of the auditory cortex than we used to, okay? But a lot of people want more from their models than just variance explained, right? You want to be able to understand something or learn something from them, okay? And so we heard yesterday about how one of the big problems with deep neural networks is that they're mush, right? It's very hard to look inside and kind of say anything about what's going on. So we were nonetheless interested in whether we could use the model to learn anything about the organization of human auditory cortex. And although saying what happens in specific units, for instance, is kind of difficult, the one sort of clear piece of structure that is present in these models is the fact that, well, in this case, they're feed-forward and hierarchical, right? So each stage gets its input from the preceding stage, and so as you move deeper and deeper into the network, you get these bigger and bigger compositions of these kind of simple functions that each stage instantiates, and so kind of things get more complicated. And so if you think that there might be hierarchical organization in a sensory system, well, it's natural to wonder whether there would be particular stages that would best predict particular regions of the cortex. So, of course, the inspiration for this comes from the ventral stream, where this has actually worked out pretty well in the sense that you can look at early stages of deep neural networks, and they do a pretty good job of predicting V1, and intermediate stages do a pretty good job of predicting V4, and later stages IT, and so forth. The difference being here that we weren't really sure what the stages would be, and so it seemed like this might be a useful exercise to maybe tell us something about the nature of the hierarchical structure. And so the analysis that I'll tell you about is going to consider just the middle layers here that give us the best predictions. And what I'm going to show you is a map of the brain where every voxel will be color-coded by the best predicting network layer. Okay, so this is the auditory cortex. These black outlines are anatomical parcellations that people often associate with primary auditory cortex, so they overlay Heschel's gyrus here, called the TE regions. Okay. And so this is what you get. So in and around what we think of as primary auditory cortex, the voxels are colored pink, which means that there's like a middle layer of the network that gives you the best predictions. And then around that, there's this sea of cyan, which indicates that a deeper layer is best. So it certainly looks like we have pretty clear evidence for sort of two stages of hierarchical organization that you might loosely think of as like the core and the belt. We were interested to note that there was not really any obvious tertiary structure, so we didn't really see clear evidence for the three stages that people often talk about in the non-human animal auditory system, with the core, the belt, and the parabelt. Doesn't mean it's not there, and again, with a different experiment, you might be able to get better resolution. But with these methods in this experiment, this is what you get. All right. So there's certainly, in the auditory system had been a lot of speculation about hierarchical organization in the auditory cortex, and I think the extent to which people believed in it really depended on who you would talk to. But I think this is like some compelling evidence for that, at least at this scale of analysis. Okay, so another natural question that you might pose is, well, what is the hierarchy doing, right? So what changes between the pink and the blue here? Okay, and can we use the model in any way to get some insight into this? And so, again, neural networks are often mush, but there are some things that you can do to look inside of them to try to get some insight into what is happening. And so one thing that you can do is to try to decode different types of information from different stages of the model. So we asked how well different properties of sound can be linearly classified from the features at different layers. And so the general thing to do here is you take your trained network, you freeze it, and then you just train up like simple classifiers on top of the different hidden layers, and then measure how well you can estimate quantities of interest. Okay, so one obvious thing is just the spectrum. So that's like how well you can actually reconstruct the cochlear representation from the different stages of the network. And so that is shown here. So what's plotted here is like the variance that's explained in the initial stage of cochlear filter responses from each layer of the network. And what happens is it just gets progressively worse. As you move through the network, the information about the spectrum seems to progressively kind of become lost. Okay? Here's that same exercise, but performed on the responses of these linear filters that operate on the cochlear representation that are kind of tuned to like simple patterns in time and frequency. And so there, you actually do best at reconstructing the responses if you're kind of somewhere in the middle of the network. Here's what happens if you actually try to perform one of the tasks that the networks were optimized for. So this is speech recognition or word recognition. So we're plotting the proportion of words that you can correctly identify given the features at the different stages of the network. And maybe unsurprisingly, kind of that gets better and better and better. Okay, so this is, of course, kind of loosely consistent with this idea that the cochlear representation is being transformed to make the information that you need for the task more and more explicit. And I guess it arguably kind of has to be that way. When we looked in more detail at this, though, we saw something kind of interesting. So this was a speech recognition in noise task. And so in some cases, the network is hearing speech that doesn't have much noise at all, sometimes no noise. And in some cases, there's a lot of noise. And so we separately analyzed the ability to extract speech information depending on the noise level. Okay, so that's split up here. So the top graph is showing how well you can recognize clean speech, that's speech without any noise, from each layer of the network. And then the bottom graph here is showing how well you can recognize speech at a pretty low SNR. So minus 9 dB is pretty challenging listening conditions. Like you'd just barely be able to kind of make out what was said. And sometimes you would make a lot of mistakes. And so unsurprisingly, like the task is intrinsically harder when you put a lot of noise in, and so overall the performance is worse, right? There's no free lunch. But we were interested in the fact that the shape of these graphs was different, okay? So in other words, the performance when you don't have noise kind of shoots up pretty quickly, whereas the performance in noise sort of doesn't really reach a peak until pretty deep in the network, okay? And that becomes easy to see if you kind of normalize them based on the performance in the last layer, right? So the performance when you have noise takes quite a while to kind of reach peak performance. So this kind of suggested that one of the things that is happening with the hierarchical organization in the network, at least, is that you build up some degree of noise robustness. Okay? Still not clear how, but it seems to be one thing that happens. And so I'll just maybe pause and say that one of the other things that's kind of attractive about having a model like this is experiments are cheap. You own the model, right? You got it all in your hands, and so you can do whatever you want with this. And so you can run a whole lot of experiments on it, find the ones that seem kind of interesting, and then use those results as inspiration to go do what might be a fairly expensive, say, fMRI experiment. Okay? So that's what we did. So this kind of raised the possibility that maybe one of the things that would actually vary within the auditory cortex would be the noise robustness. So Alex did another fMRI experiment where we played people natural sounds, and the natural sounds were either clean or superimposed on real-world background noise. So here's an example of a clean sound. This is somebody sharpening a knife. Let's play that again. Okay, that's a knife sharpening. This is now a knife sharpening in a train station. I realize that's morbid. Okay, so you can still kind of tell that it's a knife sharpening. Okay, all right. And so the question here would be, to what extent does the background noise alter the neural representation of these sounds? All right. So we measure the voxel responses to a set of 30 sounds, like knife sharpening and stuff like that. We measure the responses to the same sounds superimposed on noise, and then we ask how similar they are by just measuring the correlation coefficient between those two vectors. So for every voxel in the brain, we're going to get that correlation. And so this is a map of neural noise robustness, and we're going to again color code our voxels based on the similarity of the responses to the clean sounds and to the noisy sounds. And so these black outlines, again, are two of those TE regions that we think of as identifying primary auditory cortex to some extent. And so if the voxel is colored blue, that means that it's not very robust, namely that the presence of noise really alters the response a lot. And if the voxel is yellow, that means that the response is pretty invariant to the noise. And so this is what you get. So it's pretty clean. In and around primary auditory cortex, things are pretty blue, meaning that the presence of the background noise really alters the responses pretty substantially. And then beyond that, you get a lot of yellow, meaning that the responses are fairly noise robust. So one point that is worth making is when we initially got these results in a pilot experiment, we were kind of concerned that maybe this would somehow just be due to the speech and music selectivity that I told you about at the start of the talk that we had prior reason to believe was present here in non-primary auditory cortex. And so in this experiment, we intentionally omitted speech and music from those set of what we call foreground sounds. So we think this is not simply about speech and music selectivity, even though some of these voxels are really strongly driven by speech or strongly driven by music. They have some more general degree of noise invariance. All right. So let me just summarize what we've talked about today. So in the start of the talk, I talked to you about some of our explorations of non-primary auditory cortex, which yielded evidence for these distinct regions of speech and music selectivity in non-primary auditory cortex that seemed consistent with a couple different pathways emerging out of primary auditory cortex. And then I told you about our efforts to develop new auditory models using deep learning applied to audio tasks. So I gave you one example of what I think are fairly compelling matches to human behavior. I talked to you about how we have used task optimization to generate hypotheses about pathway organization in the case of speech and music that gave us this dual pathway model where there are some shared stages of computation followed by kind of task-specific operations. I showed you that the result of this is that you get a better model of auditory cortex, at least according to the classic gold standard of variance explained, that you can use the model to provide some evidence for hierarchical organization in the auditory cortex where it had been a bit contentious, and also that the model gives you a way to screen hypotheses because experiments on the model are cheap, so you can try a whole lot of stuff out and then go and look in the brain, and we found that there was evidence in the model that noise robustness really kind of emerged late in the model, and we then did an experiment in people and found that that seems to be the case in the human auditory cortex as well. So I think the scientific bottom line is that we have growing evidence for two stages of auditory cortical processing in humans, maybe split up into two or more pathways. We don't yet have clear signs of additional stages, but I think some of the methods and techniques here could be profitably used to explore that further. So I just want to conclude by acknowledging the folks who led this work. So at the beginning of the talk, I talked about the work of Sam Norman-Hagner. The second part was led by Alex Kell with help from Erica Shook. Ray Gonzalez has also been kind of important. And this is in collaboration with Dan Yeamans with the second half and Nancy Camisher for the first half. Thank you all for your attention.
Hi, it's really nice talk. I was just wondering what, so the length of time of these clips, how does that compare to how long it takes for like a human to typically be able to recognize sound? Because it's interesting that you're using a ComNet because you're sort of feeding in the entire spectrograph into the model at once, so it can actually see the entire length of the entire sound clip, whereas a human would be able to recognize much quicker probably.
Yeah, for some of the sound. I mean, I think it'll vary depending on the sounds. I mean, I think 2 seconds is not totally crazy. I mean, you could probably do it faster. I mean, for these kinds of sounds, actually, we have never actually measured the recognition accuracy as a function of how much of it you hear. And I'm sure you can get well above chance with very brief clips.
Well, so then have you tried the analogous test of shortening the clip that you're feeding into into your model?
I mean, we haven't, but in part that's because that's not what we did in the neuroscience experiments, right? So the 2-second sounds that we're playing when we're comparing it to the neural data are because that's what we presented to people in the scanner, and so we just didn't have a very strong reason to make them shorter. But I think that could be interesting to do.
I guess, well, the reason that I'm asking is because it seems to me that comprehension of like temporal sounds it seems a little counterintuitive to me to use a convolutional neural network in your model when we have a lot of like recurrent neural network models that could possibly be more intuitive to use.
Yeah, somebody always asks this question when I talk about this stuff, and I should really be preempting it in the talk. I mean, I'm totally sympathetic with that. I mean, I guess I would say that it's not at all obvious to me that there should be any substantial computational difference between using a convolutional architecture and something that's recurrent. I mean, it's like the difference between an FIR and an IIR filter. I mean, they're not the same, but you can usually swap one out for the other, and nobody's the wiser. Certainly at an implementation level, they're very different. These are not really, I certainly don't think of these as like circuit level models of what's happening in the brain, So that's why we haven't really confronted that too much. So my prediction is that you could essentially replicate all of these results with a recurrent model, but we haven't tried it.
Yeah, thank you.
Sorry. I was wondering what types of behaviors you think music representations are involved in, and
music representations, you said?
Yeah, like specifically what types of behaviors those representations would be involved in, and if thinking about those behaviors could give us insight into predictions on how those representations would be organized in the brain.
Yeah, I mean, at this point, we don't know a whole lot. So, I mean, Dana, who has a poster today, is kind of actively working on this. So maybe next year she'll have something to show you. Yeah, I mean, there's some evidence that the response is actually kind of driven by stuff that kind of happens in the very initial portions of the sound, the first few 100 milliseconds. My personal suspicion is that it's got to do with things like extracting notes and representing notes, and I don't think it's anything terribly long scale. We do actually have some evidence where we've scrambled music at different time scales. This is unpublished, but we use this method called quilting that we use to explore speech selectivity. And it seems like there's the temporal structure that is really driving the response is like on the order of up to half a second maybe. So that places some constraints on it, but at present we don't know that much.
Cool, thank you.
Thank you. So great stuff, Josh. As you probably know, there's a lot of evidence, or not a lot, but at least some evidence from non-human animals about the structure of noise in the context of robustness, or at least tuning as it falls across primary auditory cortex, either in the bandwidth or its relation to the modulation transfer function of the noise itself. And so I wonder if you could tell us anything about the spectrum of the noise and whether or not you see any relationship between components of the noise spectrum that you're using to mask the signal and its relationship to tuning in the auditory cortex or not.
Sorry, you're talking about the noise that was used in like this experiment?
Yeah, in the last one.
So it's very heterogeneous by design. So these are what we would normally call sound textures. So they're like natural sounds that happen to be homogeneous and stationary. So it's all over the place. Yeah. All right.